It was early October when I booked a small Airbnb on the edge of a quiet mountain town in Oregon. I needed a few days away from work, from screens, from people. The listing showed a small one-bedroom cabin tucked behind tall pine trees, described as peaceful, private, perfect for solo travelers. The pictures showed sunlight pouring through big windows, a small wooden deck, and a cozy interior with a fireplace. It looked safe, calm, almost too perfect. I booked it for 4 nights without much thought. The drive there took longer than I expected. My phone lost service for the last hour, and the road narrowed into a single lane surrounded by dense woods. The further I went, the quieter it got. Even the hum of civilization, the sound of passing cars or distant planes, disappeared completely. I remember how strange that silence felt. I could only hear the crunch of gravel under my tires and the low hum of my car's engine. The GPS froze halfway there, so I followed printed directions from the host. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, with sunlight slanting through the trees, lighting up specks of dust in the air. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, maybe a little older but still nice. There was no one around for what looked like miles. The driveway was a stretch of loose gravel that ended right by the porch. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. I unlocked the front door with the code the host sent me and stepped inside. It was clean. Wooden floors, a small kitchen, a couch, and a single bed pushed against the wall near a large window that looked out toward the forest. The place had a faint smell of lemon cleaner mixed with something musty, like old wood that had absorbed years of moisture. After unpacking, I walked around the property. There was a shed behind the cabin, old and weathered, its lock rusted. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Behind it, the woods grew thick and dark. I didn't go far. The trees seemed to swallow light the deeper I looked. I went back inside, made dinner, and watched the sky turn orange through the window. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. That night, I noticed something odd. Around midnight, I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps outside. Slow, crunching steps moving through the gravel. I froze in bed, trying to listen carefully. It wasn't an animal. It sounded heavier, more deliberate. The steps paused near the porch, and then I heard what sounded like the wooden boards creak, as if someone stepped onto it. My heart started pounding. I stayed still, eyes wide open, trying to hear if they were coming closer. Then silence. A full minute passed. Then 2. I waited longer before forcing myself to peek out the window. I couldn't see anyone, just the edge of the porch and the dark woods beyond. I told myself it might have been an animal after all, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the gravel outside the porch. They weren't mine. I could clearly see the shape of a boot sole, deep in the dirt, leading toward the side of the cabin and disappearing into the trees. My stomach sank. The air felt colder even though the sun was out. I didn't know what to do, but there wasn't much I could do. There was no cell signal and the cabin didn't have Wi-Fi. I could drive back to town, but it was a long trip just for what could have been some hiker wandering by. I tried to distract myself that day, reading, walking a bit on the nearby trail, cooking, but I kept glancing at the window, half expecting someone to walk past. Around late afternoon, while sitting on the couch, I noticed something through the window facing the forest. There was a faint reflection of movement, something shifting among the trees. I stared hard, waiting. For a moment, I thought I saw the outline of a figure standing still between the trunks, far back enough that I couldn't make out any details. When I blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was just the play of shadows, I told myself. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave. That night, I barely slept. I left a light on in the kitchen, the kind that casts a warm glow through the small space. Around 3 a.m., I woke again, this time to a soft sound like metal tapping against glass. It was faint but rhythmic, coming from the side window near the bed. My body tensed up immediately. I didn't move. I listened as the tapping stopped, followed by the faintest scrape against the glass, like someone dragging a fingertip slowly across it. My chest tightened so much it hurt. I stared at the window, but the curtain blocked my view. I didn't have the courage to pull it open. After what felt like forever, it stopped. Silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was a tree branch or an animal. But when I finally checked outside in the morning, I saw clear smudges on the window, long, greasy streaks like the prints of someone's hand dragged slowly down the glass. That day, I decided I'd leave early. I didn't care if I lost money for the last night. But before I packed, I went outside to look around one last time. The ground near the side window had deep impressions, fresh ones. The same boot prints as before. They led around the cabin toward the back. I followed them, my heart pounding louder with every step. The tracks ended near the shed. The lock that had looked rusted shut when I arrived was now broken, hanging loosely. The door stood slightly open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of rot. Dust covered everything. Old tools, a broken chair, spider webs in the corners. But what made me stop cold was a small pile of cigarette butts on the floor and an empty water bottle that looked new. Someone had been in there recently, maybe even while I was staying in the cabin. My brain went into panic mode. I ran back inside, packed my stuff as fast as I could, barely remembering to zip my bag. When I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Deep in the woods between two trees, I could see a shape. Someone standing there, still as stone, watching. I didn't wait to look longer. I got in my car, turned it on, and drove off so fast that gravel shot behind the tires. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station in town, nearly an hour away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I finally got service again, so I called the Airbnb support line to report what happened. They said they'd contact the local police and the host. Later that night, I got a short message saying the police went to check the property but didn't find anyone there. Just signs that someone might have been squatting nearby. A week later, I checked the listing again. It was gone, completely removed. No host name, no reviews, nothing. Like it had never existed. Even now, I can still see that figure standing between the trees whenever I close my eyes. The worst part wasn't that someone had been there watching me. It was realizing they'd probably been there the whole time. Maybe even before I arrived. Maybe that perfect private cabin had never really been empty at all. I booked the Airbnb last winter when I needed a break from everything. It was a small cabin outside a quiet rural town in Idaho, surrounded by nothing but frozen fields and woods. I didn't know anyone there, and that was exactly what I wanted. The listing said it was perfect for solitude and reflection, with a small fireplace and a view of the valley. The pictures showed a cozy interior, wood-paneled walls, an old rug, and a big window that looked out toward the forest. It looked peaceful, maybe even too peaceful, but I booked it anyway. I just wanted silence. The drive took nearly 8 hours. The last 2 were on a narrow road that turned into gravel halfway through. It had snowed recently, so the ground was slick and uneven. I passed a few abandoned barns and rusted-out trucks that looked like they hadn't moved in decades. When I finally reached the place, it was nearly evening. The sky had that dull gray color that comes right before nightfall. The cabin looked smaller than I expected. The paint was peeling, and the steps creaked when I carried my bags inside. The air smelled faintly like wood smoke and old fabric. It wasn't dirty, but it had that closed-up feeling like it hadn't been lived in for a while. I unpacked, lit the fireplace, and made something simple to eat. The place only had one big room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a small bathroom tucked in the corner. It felt isolated in a way that was both nice and a little uncomfortable. That first night, I sat on the couch reading while the wind rattled outside. There were no other houses nearby, not even lights in the distance. The silence was thick. I could hear every small sound. The creak of the wood, the faint ticking of the heater, the occasional crack from the fireplace. Around midnight, I started hearing something else. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow outside. It was slow, deliberate. I thought maybe it was a deer or an animal. But after a few moments, I realized it was circling the cabin. I could hear it moving from one side to another, pausing between steps. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the window. The glass reflected the light from the fire, so I couldn't see outside clearly. I waited, listening, until the sound faded toward the trees. I sat there for almost an hour before I convinced myself it was an animal. But something about the pace of those steps bothered me. They weren't random like a wandering animal, they were too steady, too slow. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the snow. There were tracks all right, boot prints. They started near the edge of the forest, circled the cabin twice, and disappeared toward the back. The prints were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy or had been standing still for a while. I followed them a little ways, but the snow made it hard to see where they went after about 30 feet. I tried to tell myself it was maybe the owner checking on the property, but it didn't feel right. There was no car, no tire marks, nothing. I tried to brush it off. I made coffee, worked a bit on my laptop, and pretended it didn't bother me. Still, I kept glancing out the window at the tree line. The trees were dense, and the shadows between them looked darker than usual. Every time the wind blew, it felt like something moved just beyond where I could see. That evening, I went outside again before sunset. The snow had stopped, but the air was sharp and cold enough to sting my nose. I walked around the cabin once more, checking for anything out of place. The prints from before were mostly covered by new snow, but I noticed something new. A few fresh ones leading up to the side window. They stopped right below it. Whoever made them had stood there for a while. I could tell because the snow was packed down deep in one spot. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it. I sat by the fire again, but I couldn't focus on anything. Every creak from the walls made me jump. Hours passed, and I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. It was just a weird coincidence. I kept thinking. The area was rural, maybe hunters or hikers sometimes wandered close. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound, something brushing against the window. It wasn't wind. It was soft, slow, like fingers dragging lightly across glass. My stomach turned cold. I stayed in bed, staring toward the dark window. The sound came again, a slow, scraping noise, then silence. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. I just listened. After a few seconds, there was a dull tap, then another. I knew what that meant. Someone was outside. I didn't get up. I just waited, barely breathing. After a few minutes, I heard crunching again. Footsteps in the snow, moving away from the cabin this time. The sound faded until there was nothing but the wind again. When I finally gathered the courage to look in the morning, there were more prints, new ones, leading straight from the trees to the window. The shape of the prints looked the same as before, but now I could see where the person had stopped. There were faint handprints smudged across the bottom edge of the window glass. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I started packing my things fast, barely even folding clothes. I just wanted to leave. As I was throwing things into my bag, I noticed something strange. On the inside of the door, near the handle, there was a small scratch. A thin line of metal exposed where paint had been scraped off, like someone had tried to slide something through the lock. I hadn't noticed it before. I loaded my car and got ready to leave, but the battery didn't start on the first try. For a moment, I thought I'd be stuck there, completely alone. The second try worked, and when the engine came to life, I felt something close to relief for the first time in 2 days. As I turned to pull out of the driveway, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing near the edge of the woods, far enough away that I couldn't see details, but close enough that I could tell it was a person. They were standing still, facing the cabin. I didn't stop to look longer. I just drove. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road almost half an hour later. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop checking the mirror, half expecting a car or figure behind me. But the road was empty the entire way back. When I got home, I reported the incident to Airbnb. They said they'd contact the host and investigate. A week later, I got a short message saying the listing had been taken down. They didn't tell me why, and I didn't ask. Months have passed since then, but sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about those boot prints in the snow. How they circled the cabin, how they stopped under my window. Whoever that was, they weren't lost or passing through. They were watching. I keep thinking about how long they might have been there before I even noticed. How maybe they watched me pull up, unload my things, move around inside. Maybe they stood out there every night, waiting for the right moment. When I checked again out of curiosity, the cabin's address was gone from Airbnb completely. No listing, no pictures, nothing. Like it was erased. But I know that place is still there, sitting quiet in the snow, with that single big window facing the forest. And I know whoever was out there watching me probably knows it too. I booked an Airbnb in a small coastal town in Northern California after weeks of wanting a quiet place to finish a freelance project. The listing showed a small, single-story guest house behind a larger main home, surrounded by overgrown hedges and a fence that almost disappeared into tall grass. The pictures looked cozy, white walls, clean wooden floors, a small deck facing a line of trees. The host described it as secluded, peaceful, and perfect for working travelers. It seemed harmless, cheap too. I booked it for 6 nights. I arrived in the late afternoon after a 6-hour drive. The town felt half empty. A few stores sat along the main road, many of them closed or boarded up. The air smelled like salt and damp wood. The property was about 10 minutes from the ocean, tucked along a dirt road that barely fit one car. The main house looked old, paint peeling, roof slightly sagging, but the small guest house in the back looked fine. It sat separated from the main home by a narrow, overgrown path. There was a deck with a table and 2 chairs, one of which had a rip in the seat. When I walked in, the air inside felt still, as if no one had opened a window in weeks. The furniture was simple. A bed, a small couch, a kitchenette, a table with 1 chair, and a bathroom with an old mirror that had rust spots around the edges. The place smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic underneath it, like damp metal. The host had left a small binder on the counter with a handwritten note. "Enjoy your stay. Please don't go near the main house." That last sentence stuck out immediately. I remember reading it twice, trying to figure out if it was meant as a warning or just a privacy thing. That first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made dinner, and spent hours working on my laptop. The Wi-Fi was weak but usable. Around 11 p.m., I stepped outside onto the deck to get some air. The wind carried the sound of the ocean faintly in the distance, mixed with the rustle of leaves. I stood there for a while until I noticed something faint, a light flickering inside the main house. Not steady light, like from a lamp, but irregular, like someone moving around with a flashlight. It disappeared after a few seconds. I didn't think much of it. Maybe the host lived there. The listing didn't say it was empty. I went back inside, locked the door, and went to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The air felt colder, damp somehow, and when I opened the door, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt between the guest house and the main home. They weren't mine. Too big, spaced far apart, like from someone walking barefoot or in flat shoes. The weird part was how deep the impressions were. The ground was soft, so the prints stood out clearly, leading from the main house to somewhere behind my cabin, then looping back. I followed them only for a few steps before I stopped. The grass behind the house was waist-high and thick, and I couldn't see where they led. That day I worked for hours, trying not to let my mind wander. I told myself maybe the host had come by during the night to check on something. But later, around 5 p.m., I stepped outside again and noticed the front gate that led to the dirt road was slightly open. I knew I had closed it when I arrived. The latch was bent a little, like it had been forced. I closed it again and tried not to think too much about it. By the 3rd night, I started feeling uneasy. The kind of unease that doesn't come from one big thing but 100 small things adding up. The way the air felt heavier after sunset. The faint creaks coming from the walls even when there was no wind. The sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin in the early morning hours, slow and deliberate. I would sit in bed, staring at the dark window, waiting for the noise to stop. On the 4th night, I was working late when I noticed movement outside. Through the window near the table, I saw the faint outline of someone standing near the hedges by the path to the main house. I froze. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, faintly visible in the weak glow from my cabin light. I stared for what felt like minutes. Then the figure turned slightly, and I realized whoever it was had been facing my window, watching. I stood up slowly, heart pounding so hard it hurt. When I blinked, the figure was gone. I barely slept that night. I sat in bed with every light on, listening. Sometime past 2 a.m., I heard a slow creak, like footsteps on the deck outside. Then a faint thud, like someone brushing against the wall. The doorknob rattled once, gently, like someone testing it. My stomach dropped. I held my breath, waiting, staring at the shadow under the door. After a few seconds, it stopped. Then silence again. When daylight came, I packed my things. I couldn't stay another night. But when I went to load my bags into the car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were muddy handprints on the side of my car, smeared near the door handle. Large, uneven smudges, like someone had tried to open it in the dark. I looked toward the main house. The curtains on the upstairs window were half open, and I could have sworn I saw a faint shadow move behind them. I grabbed my keys, started the car, and drove off without even locking the cabin. About an hour later, I stopped in town to get gas and some food. The cashier told me that the road where I'd stayed used to have several rental homes, but many were abandoned now. When I mentioned the address, she looked confused. She said the house at that address had been condemned 2 years ago after a fire. No one was supposed to be living there. I thought maybe she was mistaken, but the look on her face said she wasn't. When I got home, I checked the Airbnb listing again. It was gone, completely removed. No trace of the host or the reviews. I contacted Airbnb support, explaining what had happened, but they couldn't find the listing in their system either. They said the ID number didn't exist anymore. Weeks passed, and I tried to put it out of my head, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about that binder on the counter with the note that said, "Please don't go near the main house." I kept replaying the shadow in the upstairs window, the footprints behind the cabin, the handprints on my car. A month later, out of curiosity or maybe guilt for leaving so fast, I searched that same area on Google Maps. I zoomed into the property. The satellite image showed the main house, burned out and dark, roof partially collapsed. The guest house was there too, but the image looked old, overgrown, empty, long abandoned. That's when it hit me. The house I stayed in had probably been one of the abandoned ones. Someone else must have been using it, maybe living there secretly, squatting or hiding. Maybe they saw that the listing was up and just never left when people came to rent it. The thought made me feel sick. Every time I think about it, I realize how lucky I was. Whoever was watching me could have done anything. They had access to the property, to my car, to the woods surrounding the place. No one in that town would have heard me if something happened. The scariest part isn't even the idea that someone was out there. It's that someone might still be using that same house, listing it again under a different name, waiting for another person like me to show up alone, far from help, with no signal and no clue where they really are. I booked the Airbnb because I needed somewhere cheap and quiet to stay while driving across the state. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a one-night stop before continuing my trip the next morning. The listing showed a small guest house behind someone's main home, located in a rural area outside a small Oregon town. It had decent reviews, a few photos of the interior, and the price was half of what the motels nearby wanted. It looked clean and simple, and I didn't think much more about it when I clicked book. The drive there took longer than expected. By the time I turned off the highway, the sun was already setting. The road turned from asphalt to cracked pavement, then to gravel, winding through miles of open fields and thick patches of trees. I didn't see any houses for a long time, just miles of isolation. Eventually, I spotted the right address painted on a mailbox leaning sideways near a wooden fence. The main house was barely visible through the trees, a large 2-story farmhouse with peeling paint and a dim light glowing from one upstairs window. The guest house was a smaller, single-story building off to the side, maybe 40 or 50 yards from the main house. It looked old but sturdy. Beige paint, a small porch with a single step, and a motion light above the door that flickered when I walked up. There was a key in a lockbox by the door, just like the host said. Inside, The air was cold and smelled faintly of old wood and cleaning products. The place was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom, and a little kitchenette. Everything looked clean but old. The bedspread was patterned with faded flowers, and the lamp beside it buzzed faintly when I turned it on. The windows were covered with thin curtains that barely blocked the view of the outside. The kitchen had a small fridge, a microwave, and a single counter with a sink. It was quiet, so quiet it almost made my ears ring. The only sounds were the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. I didn't see anyone around, not even the host. The message they'd sent earlier said they'd give me space, and I figured they meant it literally. After I dropped my bag on the bed, I looked out the small window near the kitchenette. The main house was dark now except for that one faint light still glowing in the upstairs window. I could see no movement, no car in the driveway, no sign of life. Just that light. I didn't think too much of it. I made myself a sandwich, plugged my phone into the charger, and laid on the bed scrolling through old pictures until my eyes felt heavy. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but it must have been sometime after midnight. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just soft, quick, like a faint shuffle of something brushing against wood. I opened my eyes and stared into the dark room, waiting for my mind to catch up. The fridge was still humming quietly, but that wasn't the sound I heard. Came again, a little louder this time. A slow creak, like weight shifting on a wooden board. It was coming from outside the window. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was an animal. I held my breath, waiting. Then came another noise, soft but clear, the faint metallic sound of a doorknob being tested. The sound of metal turning slightly but not opening. I felt my stomach tighten. The motion light outside didn't turn on, which made it worse. Whoever or whatever was out there was staying just beyond its reach. The sound stopped for a few seconds, and I strained to listen. Then I heard slow footsteps, deliberate, measured, moving along the side of the guest house. I stayed completely still. My phone was on the nightstand, and I reached for it as quietly as I could. No signal. I watched the small bar in the corner of the screen flicker from one bar to no service. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps moved toward the back of the house now. I heard another faint creak, then the sound of a finger or something brushing lightly against the window pane. Just one slow drag across the glass. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. Then everything went silent again. No footsteps, no scraping, nothing. Just the sound of the fridge humming in the background. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body stiff with tension. As soon as light started seeping through the curtains, I got up and looked outside. The grass was still damp with morning dew, but I could see faint impressions. Footprints leading from the back of the house to the side window, then back toward the trees near the edge of the property. They weren't animal prints. They were from boots. I tried to tell myself it might have been the owner checking on the property, maybe early in the morning. But the thought didn't sit right. Why would anyone be walking quietly around the guest house at 3 a.m. instead of just knocking? I made coffee and sat near the window for a while, trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked at the main house, that upstairs window still had the same dim light glowing. By afternoon, I decided to take a walk just to clear my head. I followed the gravel driveway up toward the tree line. The air smelled like damp earth, and the woods behind the property were dense and shadowy. From up the hill, I could see the guest house and the main home below. That same upstairs window glowed faintly even in daylight, like the bulb had been left on for days. Something about it bothered me, the stillness of it, how I hadn't seen a single person anywhere. When I went back down, I noticed something new. The motion light above the guest house door had been turned off completely. The switch inside still said on, but the light didn't react at all when I moved under it. That night, I didn't sleep in the bed. I sat on the couch with my phone plugged in, flashlight in hand, facing the front door. I kept the lamp on, trying to stay awake. The clock ticked endlessly, each second slower than the last. Around 2:30, the light flickered once, then dimmed. A few seconds later, I heard it again, slow footsteps in the grass. They came from behind the house, steady and unhurried. Then the sound stopped right outside the window again. I could feel it, that weight of someone standing there, just on the other side of the wall. I aimed my flashlight toward the glass but didn't turn it on. I waited, barely breathing. Faint tap, then another. The sound of a fingernail against the window. Slow, deliberate, spaced apart, one after another. The air felt heavy. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. Then suddenly silence again. The next morning I went outside to check. The footprints were deeper this time, like whoever it was had been standing still for a while. I looked toward the main house again. The light was still glowing in the upstairs window. On impulse, I walked closer to the house, around to the front porch. The steps were covered in leaves, and there were no fresh footprints there. Not even mine until that moment. The porch rail was covered in dust and cobwebs. The door frame was cracked, and the lock looked rusted. I felt uneasy. I walked to one of the lower windows and peered inside. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no lights, no sign of anyone living there. Just bare wooden floors and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, still glowing weakly. That was when I realized how wrong everything was. The house was abandoned. Completely. That light had been on for who knows how long, and there hadn't been anyone inside it. I went straight back to the guest house, packed my things, and left. I didn't even lock the door behind me. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a gas station with a weak phone signal and opened the Airbnb app. The listing was gone, completely deleted. Not unavailable, gone. Like it had never existed. I never heard back from the host. I sent a message through the platform just in case, but it bounced back with an error. I tried searching for the address again later, but nothing came up. A month later, out of curiosity, I looked up the address on Google Maps. The main house was still there, the same old farmhouse, the same guest house behind it. But the satellite image looked dated. According to the map, the property had been abandoned for years. The last recorded update was from 3 years ago. I stared at the photo for a long time, thinking about those nights. The quiet footsteps, the scraping on the glass, the dead light still burning in an empty house. Someone had been walking around that property while I was sleeping. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And whoever it was, they'd been doing it long before I ever arrived. I booked the Airbnb for a week. It was a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. The pictures made it look cozy, clean, simple, and affordable. I wanted a place to get away for a while, somewhere I could work on a few projects and have peace. The reviews were mostly good, though a few people mentioned something odd about the basement. I didn't think much of it. Most people complain about small things when they travel, so I ignored it. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet the area was. The street was narrow, lined with small trees and identical houses that looked abandoned in the middle of the day. The Airbnb was the last one on the street, a single-story house with peeling white paint and a small porch that sagged slightly to one side. There was a faint smell of damp wood when I opened the door, but the inside looked fine, old but clean enough. The air felt heavy, though, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. I dropped my bag on the couch and walked through the place. The kitchen was small, with a window facing the backyard that looked out onto a dense wall of trees. The hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. There was a door near the end of the hall with a padlock hanging on the outside. The lock was old and rusted, and it had a faint oily smell, like it had been handled often. I assumed it was a closet or a storage room. I went on with my evening, made some food, and sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. But I couldn't stop noticing the faint sounds in the background. A low hum, maybe the fridge or the pipes in the wall. Every once in a while, I'd hear something else, like the soft creak of wood coming from the back of the house. I tried to ignore it. It was an old place. Old houses made noises. That first night was strange. I went to bed around midnight, but I couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing something underneath me. The floor had a hollow feel when I walked on it, and now I could hear faint shuffling or tapping sounds coming from below. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone moving things around under the floorboards. I turned on my phone flashlight and looked around, thinking maybe there was a vent or something connected to the basement. There wasn't. The sound was distant, but it was definitely under me. By morning it stopped. I convinced myself it was just pipes or maybe small animals under the floor. I went out for groceries and tried not to think about it. When I got back later that day, I noticed something odd. The padlock on the basement door was turned the other way. I remembered it clearly because the first night I saw it hanging with the keyhole facing the wall. Now it faced outward. It was a tiny detail, but it bothered me. I checked the listing again on my phone. There was no mention of a basement, just storage space not available for guests. Maybe the owner had come by for maintenance or something. Still, the idea of someone being inside while I was gone made me uneasy. I decided to take a photo of the lock, just to see if anything changed again. That night, it got worse. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a dull thudding sound coming from below. It wasn't faint this time. It was heavy, like something dropping or someone knocking against wood. I froze in bed, trying to figure out if it was coming from inside the walls or under the house. Then it stopped for a few minutes before starting again. Slower this time. I turned on every light in the house. I walked to the hallway and stood in front of the locked door. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. The sound seemed to come from directly behind that door. I crouched down and pressed my ear against it. For a few seconds, I heard nothing. Then a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged slowly across concrete. I backed away and went to the kitchen, grabbed a chair, and sat there until the sun came up. In the morning, I took another photo of the lock. It had been turned again, same direction as the first night. I looked closely and noticed tiny scratch marks around the keyhole, like someone had been forcing it open. I felt sick. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me wanted to understand what was happening. I messaged the owner about it, mentioning that the lock seemed tampered with and that I was hearing strange noises. No response that day. By evening, I started packing my stuff, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what was behind that door before I left. I found an old screwdriver in the kitchen drawer. The padlock wasn't strong. It looked old enough to break if I used enough pressure. I hesitated for a while, standing there staring at it, before finally wedging the screwdriver under the latch and forcing it upward. The lock snapped open with a dull metallic crack. The door swung open into a short staircase leading down into darkness. The air that came out was cold and damp, carrying a strong smell of rot and rust. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped down slowly. The stairs creaked with each step, and the beam of my flashlight shook from my unsteady hands. At the bottom, there was a concrete floor covered in dirt. The basement wasn't big, just a single square room with an old water heater in one corner and some wooden shelves on the other side. But right away, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There was a small mattress on the floor. Next to it, a few empty water bottles, a blanket, and some cans of food. Someone had been living down there. The blanket was still warm when I touched it. That's what made my whole body go cold. Whoever had been sleeping there wasn't gone for long. I backed away toward the stairs, my flashlight shaking across the walls. That's when I saw something else. A narrow hole in the far wall, just big enough for a person to crawl through. The dirt around it was freshly disturbed. It led somewhere deeper, maybe under the house. I didn't stay to find out. I dropped the flashlight and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I shoved a chair against the handle and threw my stuff into my bag. I was out the door in seconds, running to my car parked out front. I didn't even look back. When I got to a gas station miles away, I finally checked my phone. There was a new message from the Airbnb owner. It said, "Do not open the basement door. It's locked for a reason. We're aware of a situation involving a former tenant who refuses to leave the property. The police are handling it." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just that message. I called the police myself, told them everything, and gave them the address. A few hours later, an officer called me back. They said they found signs that someone had been living down there for months. The tunnel led under the neighboring property. They thought the person had been sneaking in and out at night through the crawl space. They hadn't caught them yet. I deleted the Airbnb app the next day. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep without checking under my bed or locking every door twice. Every small sound in my apartment made me tense. Sometimes I still think about that basement, about how the blanket was warm, about how the lock kept turning when I wasn't there. Whoever that person was, they were coming up into the house at night, walking around while I slept, probably standing in that hallway just outside my door, listening. And I'll never know how many nights they did. I booked the Airbnb on a quiet Wednesday night after another long week at work. I wanted somewhere far from everything, a place where no one would bother me, where I could sleep without the sound of cars or people outside my window. I found a small guest house listed just outside a small town in northern Idaho. The pictures made it look perfect. A single-story cabin-style house surrounded by fields, a gravel driveway, and a view of forested hills in the distance. The price was cheap, too cheap maybe, but it had good reviews. Everyone mentioned how peaceful it was, how private it felt. That's all I wanted. The drive took most of the day. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. By the time I reached the property, there were only long stretches of open fields and a narrow dirt road lined with tall grass. The guest house sat about 100 yards off the main road, behind an old barn. It was small. Pale yellow paint peeling from the siding, windows framed with dark trim, a tin roof that looked like it would rattle in the wind. There was no sign of the host, no one around at all. Just the house, a key in a small lockbox, and the sound of crickets coming from the tall grass. Inside, the place was simple. A small kitchen with a 2-burner stove, a tiny fridge, a table with 2 chairs. The living area had an old couch, a wooden coffee table, and a flat-screen TV mounted crookedly on the wall. The bedroom was small but clean. White sheets, thin curtains, a small nightstand with a lamp that flickered a little when I turned it on. There was also a faint smell inside, something earthy and stale, like the house hadn't been opened in a while. I unpacked my bag and stepped outside for a bit. The air was cool and dry, the sky clear. The property stretched out for acres, and beyond the barn, I could see a faint tree line leading into the woods. There was a small shed off to the right of the barn, old, leaning slightly to one side, its door hanging half open. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. That night was quiet, almost too quiet. I ate some instant noodles I'd brought, sat on the couch, and scrolled through my phone until the signal dropped completely. I decided to get some rest. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the soft hum of the fridge. I locked the doors and shut off the lights. I woke up around 2 a.m. It was dead silent, but something felt off. The air felt heavier still. I sat up slowly, trying to listen. Then I heard it. A faint metallic clink, like something brushing against metal, came from outside, near the barn. Then again, a little louder this time. I stayed completely still, listening. My first thought was maybe an animal, a raccoon or something knocking into a bucket. I lay back down and waited. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and I eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The ground was still damp with dew, and there were faint impressions in the dirt near the barn, footprints, or at least something that looked like them. They weren't clear, but they were definitely from boots, not animal prints. I followed them a few steps, but they disappeared into the grass. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe the host had come by during the night to check something. I spent the day reading, writing, and just sitting outside. The place really was peaceful during the day. The barn stood quiet, the shed leaned slightly in the sun, and the wind made the tall grass sway back and forth. But I kept thinking about those faint footprints. They hadn't been mentioned in the reviews, nothing about anyone living nearby or visiting. I didn't see a single person all day. That night, I made sure both doors were locked tight. I closed the curtains and left a light on in the kitchen. I fell asleep around 11. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a clinking sound. It was something softer, a steady scraping noise, like something sliding slowly against wood, came from outside, near the front porch. My heart started beating faster. I sat up, listening hard. The scraping stopped, then came again, longer this time, slow and deliberate. I didn't move. The sound stopped again, replaced by a faint shuffle of movement. The walls in that house were thin, and the sound carried easily. I could hear what I thought were footsteps, soft but heavy, moving slowly around the porch. They stopped near the front door. I stared at the dark outline of the door from my bed, barely breathing. Then came a quiet tap, just one, against the door. Then silence. I waited for what felt like hours, every sound making me flinch. Eventually, I heard the faint crunch of gravel, footsteps retreating down the driveway. I didn't move until daylight crept through the curtains. When I stepped outside that morning, I saw it clearly. The dirt on the porch had been disturbed. There were boot prints leading up to the front door and away from it. I followed them down the gravel path, but they stopped halfway toward the road, right where the grass started again. I didn't see anyone, no cars, nothing. The barn door was slightly open now. I could have sworn it had been closed the day before. Against my better judgment, I walked over and pushed it open a little more. Inside was empty except for some old tools, a few wooden crates, and a rusted wheelbarrow. The air smelled like dust and hay. I didn't see any signs of anyone staying there. That night, I decided to stay awake. I kept the lights off and sat on the couch facing the window. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw something faint. A light, maybe a small flashlight, moving slowly along the field near the shed. It wasn't bright, but I could see it weaving through the grass, then stopping. I felt my stomach tighten. The light flickered once, then disappeared. A few minutes later, I heard the same scraping sound again, this time coming from the back of the house. It was slower, softer, like someone dragging something metallic across the siding. Then silence. I didn't dare move. My phone still had no signal, and there was no landline in the house. I waited, straining my ears. The sound came again, this time closer to the window. I saw the faint shadow of movement through the curtain, like someone standing right outside. Then a soft, slow knock. I didn't move an inch. The knock came again, slightly harder. Then nothing. Minutes passed. I finally heard the faint crunch of footsteps retreating into the grass again. I stayed frozen until dawn. When I stepped outside that morning, my chest tightened. On the side of the house, near the window where I'd been sitting, there were fresh scratches along the wood. Long, deep grooves like someone had dragged a piece of metal along the wall. On the ground below the window, there was a cigarette butt, still half-burned, pressed into the dirt. I packed my things immediately. Before leaving, I looked toward the shed one last time. The door was closed now, but I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint reflection in the small window, like glass or metal catching the light. I didn't go closer. I just got in my car, started the engine, and drove down that long dirt road without looking back. When I finally got cell service again, I called the Airbnb host and told them what happened. They sounded confused and said no one else was supposed to be on the property. They said they'd check it out and get back to me. A week later, I got an email from Airbnb saying the listing had been temporarily removed. The host didn't respond again. Out of curiosity, I searched the property name a few days later. I found a short local news post. It said that police were investigating after a man's belongings were found inside a small guest house on the outskirts of town. No one had been renting it for months, and the owner hadn't lived there in over a year. I reread that line over and over again. No one had been renting it. I thought about the unlocked barn, the cigarette butt, the scratches on the siding. I thought about the footsteps outside the door and the faint shadow by the window. Whoever had been there that night wasn't supposed to be there, but neither was I. I booked the Airbnb on impulse, late one night when I couldn't sleep. I'd been stressed from work, barely eating, barely talking to anyone. I wanted a weekend alone, away from the city. The listing I found looked perfect, an off-grid cabin, about 40 minutes outside a small mountain town in Montana. The photos showed a quiet, clean little place surrounded by forest, with a view of the valley below. The description said it had solar power, a small water tank, and a wood stove. No internet, no TV, and barely any phone service. That sounded good to me. I just wanted quiet. I left early Friday morning. The farther I drove from the main road, the more empty everything felt. Long stretches of forest on both sides, not a single other car for miles. The road turned into gravel, then dirt. It took me nearly 40 minutes of winding through narrow paths before I saw the small wooden sign nailed to a tree with the name Ridgeview Cabin. The driveway was long and steep, covered in fallen leaves, and when I finally reached the cabin, it felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. The place was smaller than I expected, maybe a single room with a small bathroom off to the side. The walls were wood, the kind that still smelled faintly of pine. There was one bed against the wall, a table, a stove, and a small wood-burning heater. Everything looked clean, though the furniture was old. A big window faced the forest. There were no curtains, which I thought was strange, but I liked the view. It was nothing but trees, stretching out as far as I could see. I unloaded my stuff from the car and checked around the property. There was a small shed a few yards away from the cabin. The door was locked with a thick chain and a padlock. It looked old, maybe used for tools or storage. I noticed a few deep marks on the wood, like something had scraped against it repeatedly. The ground around it was packed down, like someone had walked there a lot. The first night was peaceful. The forest was quiet except for crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I lit the wood stove and sat by the window, watching the darkness settle between the trees. The silence was almost too thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. I went to bed early, with the window open just a crack to let in the cold night air. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise, something that didn't sound like nature. It was soft at first, like a slow crunch of leaves outside. Then another. I lay still, listening. The footsteps were faint, moving slowly, coming from the direction of the shed. I stared at the ceiling, holding my breath. After a few seconds, it stopped. Then came another sound. A faint scraping, metal against metal, like something brushing the shed's padlock. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon trying to get in. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I got up quietly and peered through the window. It was too dark to see clearly, but the shape of the shed was just barely visible. I didn't see anyone or anything moving. After a few minutes, everything went silent again. I eventually lay back down, heart still racing, and somehow managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I went straight to check the shed. The padlock was still there, but there were fresh scratches around it, shiny and new, like metal rubbed against it during the night. I knelt down and looked at the ground. There were faint boot prints in the dirt, leading away from the shed toward the tree line. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to figure out if they might have been mine. They weren't. They were larger and deeper, pressed in like whoever made them was heavy or carrying something. I spent the rest of that morning feeling uneasy. I told myself maybe it was the owner or someone maintaining the property, but that didn't explain why they'd be there in the middle of the night. I tried to distract myself, went on a short walk, made some food, read a bit. By afternoon, the feeling had dulled a little. The woods looked harmless again, golden with late sunlight. I sat outside for a while, listening to the breeze move through the trees. Everything seemed calm again, but that night things felt different. It was colder, quieter, and the air felt heavier somehow. I locked the doors, made sure the windows were shut tight, and left one dim lamp on beside the bed. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close to the cabin the night before. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, waiting to drift off. It must have been close to 3 a.m. when I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the same direction, the shed. I sat up quietly, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then came the metallic scraping again. Only this time it was louder, longer, like someone was actually trying to pry the lock off. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I held my breath and listened. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop, the distinct metallic snap of the lock breaking. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then I heard the creak of the shed door opening, the sound of wood brushing against dirt. Whoever was out there didn't move fast. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like they weren't in any rush. They stopped, then started again, coming closer, closer to the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, staring at the faint glow of the lamp on the nightstand. The footsteps stopped right outside the wall. Then silence. The floorboards under the window creaked faintly, like weight shifting outside. I turned my eyes toward the window, but I didn't move my head. I could see the faint outline of something just beyond the glass, tall, motionless. A human shape. It stood there for a long time, maybe a full minute. Then it moved slowly back toward the shed. I heard the faint creak of the door again, then nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. I waited until the first gray light of morning and went outside. The shed door was wide open. Inside were old tools, a wheelbarrow, and a few broken chairs. But there was also something else. A thin mattress laid out on the floor, a blanket, an empty bottle of water, and a pile of food wrappers. Someone had been living there. I felt my chest tighten. I walked around the side of the shed and saw more boot prints leading back into the woods. The tracks disappeared about 50 feet in. I packed my things as fast as I could, threw them into the car, and got the hell out of there. When I finally reached a spot with signal, I called the host and told them what I'd found. They sounded surprised, said no one was supposed to be staying anywhere near that cabin. They said they'd drive out and check it right away. 2 days later, I got an email from them. They thanked me for letting them know and said the police had found evidence of someone squatting on the property. They said whoever it was had probably been living in the shed for months, sneaking food and supplies from nearby houses. They'd left before the police got there, but they'd found his bedroll, clothes, and a knife hidden in the corner. For weeks after, I couldn't stop replaying that night in my head. The sound of the lock snapping, the slow footsteps, the shape standing outside the window. The thing that still bothers me most is how quiet he was. How long he must have been watching. Sometimes I wonder how long he'd been out there before I even arrived. Maybe he'd seen the listing online, realized when guests were coming. Maybe he waited for them to leave each time before slipping back into the shed. Maybe that's why the lock was so worn down already. I haven't used Airbnb since. Every time I think about that place, I picture that quiet little cabin sitting empty now, the shed door still swinging in the wind, the woods around it silent, like they're holding a secret.